Hello. So first I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Elsie Reasoner. Elsie Reasoner was born on April 25th, 1878. So yes, her birthday was just 2 days ago. According to the newspapers, she was born amidst the daisies and sunflowers and is a splendid example of the bright, cheery, breezy, self-reliant girls of the Western Plains. Just a slip of a girl, barely 20 years old. She writes well, talks well, and perhaps inherited these talents from her father, Judge Reasoner, a prominent editorial writer in Leavenworth, Kansas. When the Spanish-American War broke out, her upbringing in the editorial room beckoned her to seek her own adventures. A newspaper journalist, a model, and a sculptress are only a few of the adventures. But let's begin at the beginning with the small-town girl bound for the war. With the first sound of the bugle, I was astir, and I was determined to go to Cuba and see for myself what a real campaign and a real battle were like. In fact, I had heard what General Sherman had said, that war is hell. And I was seized with the inclination to find out for myself if he really knew what he was talking about. I first sought some encouragement from various publishers, but I must admit I got very little. In fact, all of my friends and acquaintances either laughed at me or tried to frighten me. One publisher, for whom I had hoped to write an interesting account of my experiences, he wrote to me and said, "Your proposed undertaking is absolutely preposterous and absurd." But I was pretty determined. After all the others, I made my way to McClure's. At the time, there were a whole lot of newspaper correspondents held up at Key West, trying to make their way to Cuba. But I must admit, the outlook was not looking very promising for any of us to get there. Sorry. When I propositioned Mr. McClure, he refused point blank to send me. He said, "You'll never make it through. And even if you should, you probably won't make it back alive. And I won't take that responsibility." Well, he must have seen the determination in my eyes, because then he said, "Well, if you do go, I'd be glad to take whatever you write." I thought long and hard about the situation and how I was going to get to Cuba. By going through Florida wasn't very promising, so I decided to make my way to Jamaica first. And I wrote a letter to the Osborne County farmer to my friends in Osborne County. It may interest my friends out there to know that an Osborne girl is bound for the war. I leave Saturday on the steamer at Live for Kingston, Jamaica, and here I will probably meet my father. We go on from there by dispatch boat, the Dauntless, to Santiago, where I will attempt to meet up with the Red Cross Society. I am to write an illustrated article on their working the field for McClure's magazine. I have 2 weeks leave from Omaha, and I think that I can do the trip in that length of time. I will be glad to bring the Osborne people any little souvenir that they may desire. Say, a Spaniard and alcohol. Many thanks for the many kind notices. 3 cheers for Kansas, McKinley, and Old Glory. Hastily, but very sincerely, Elsie Reasoner. Upon landing, I hurried by rail to Port Antonio. It's a beautiful spot, by the way, one about which there's very little known about in our country. By luck, the Red Cross steamer pulled into port that very night, and there I met Miss Clara Barton. With a little bit of convincing, I was permitted to go on board and join the Red Cross sisters on their way to Sheboygan. I knew that I would probably have to don a cap and apron and I would be going right out into the field with the Red Cross nurses. But I also had the satisfaction of knowing that I was the only woman correspondent who was going to be seeing this war. They called me plucky and courageous, but I guarantee you, any American girl would have been there if she would have had the chance. As we steamed into port, we noticed on our starboard bow 4 dark, gray, sinister battleships, massive cruisers, and blunt-nosed torpedo boats. The Battle of San Juan Juan had just been fought, and they were carrying men from the battlefield to the hospitals. I did what I could to help the Red Cross nurses by making gruel and carrying ice. And later, I spoke with Miss Clara Barton about her experience, and this is what she said. We arrived at night in a drizzling rain. All along the line, the wounded were lying in trenches. A few were nursing a sickly fire of soaked brushwood. No food nor comforts of any kind were visible. We immediately kindled an opposition fire and unloaded 1 cart of provisions. Out of the extracts and cordials that we brought with us, I succeeded in making a great kettle of excellent gruel. Little did I think, 25 years ago, when doing the same thing for our boys in blue and gray, that at this time and place I should be following the exact same recipe. Our next trouble was in clothing the wounded. Their terrible condition cannot be described. When they were carried in from the battlefield, their clothes were soaked with blood and rain and caked with mud. Heroic measures were necessary. And with a few quick slashes, they were cut loose, stripped off, and thrown away. Very few surgeons were there to tend to the wounds, and no provisions of any kind. The poor fellows were reduced to the primitive conditions of the savage, and could only be laid out in rows, weak, wounded, unconscious, and stark naked upon the bare, wet ground. I hope that I never again shall see such a pitiful sight. From some muslin, we cut a length of each man to cover them, tended the fitful brush fire, and made kettle after kettle of the strengthening broth. After 3 days, I slept on some boxes in an old abandoned post office. 2 things stood out to me when I was at that war, one quite as much as the other. The first was the absolute mismanagement of the commissary and the transportation departments. It was atrocious. But second, the wonderful cheerfulness of the soldiers amid great hardships and struggles. I never saw such a body of such wonderful fellows, and I have no idea that I shall ever see their like again. Why, I saw young men, hardly able to walk, who were cracking jokes with one another. I saw young men in some of those field hospitals, desperately wounded, whose only complaint was that they had been hit too early in the fight. I saw funny things too. I saw a Cuban sell a horse for half of a pineapple and a piece of tobacco. I saw General Schaefer, some 300 and some odd pounds, riding a diminutive Cuban horse. I also saw 6-foot-tall men from the Michigan Volunteers run like deer from undersized land crabs. Excuse me. A lieutenant of one of the regular regiments was brought in horribly wounded. A Mauser ball had pierced his shoulder and his hip was shot away. He called for a newspaper correspondent in the doorway and asked him to send a message. He took a pen and paper and he wrote, "Am well," and then asked that it be sent to his wife at a frontier fort in Montana. I left Cuba only 48 hours before Santiago was destroyed. I had read what General Sherman had said, that war is hell, and he was right. Oh, look at the time. I've got to get going. I made it on to the Associated Press docket vote, and I am on my way to Holland to cover the marriage of Queen Wilhelmina. Thank you all so much.